today, Hank and I'll both be teaching. Kind of, I'm doing the first half, then he's doing the second half, and we wore the same shirt, so you guys never know when we change. um, okay, so this morning, um, we're still talking about our mission statement, right? So in the fall, we did lead intentionally. Everything was about that. This spring, we've been focusing on develop progressively. And last month, Matt talked about us growing as Christians. It was really awesome. If you missed that, we're sending it out. It was so great. But to start for today, I'm going to just read the definition as it's written in our handbook. And Hank's getting the slide up. Okay, perfect. Our hope and intention is that every member of our team is always moving towards growth as both a follower of Christ and as a musician. We believe that knowing God rightly is the fuel for worship. We also believe that God deserves our first and best, so that motivates us to continue to grow as musicians using our skills to worship Him. So, that's obviously like hitting on two components, growing as a Christian and growing as a musician. Last month we talked about growing as a Christian. This month we wanted to talk about growing as a musician. So why should we grow as musicians? We're going to keep coming back to this idea of giving God our first and best. Okay, that's going to be like kind of the central axis for our whole conversation today. So that idea started coming up a couple years ago when Redeemer was going through the Worth It initiative. I always want to say the worship initiative. I was like typing yesterday and I was like, worship initiative. No, Worth It initiative. Anyways, and so basically that idea stems from the fact that the Father gave us His first and best through His Son Jesus, right? He could have had another way, right? He's God. He could have orchestrated some other means by which to reconcile us to Him, but instead He chose to give us His first and best, namely His Son Jesus, fully God, fully man. In response to that, we're often prone to give our last and worst back to Him, right? We want to hold on to the things that are most dear to us, or we don't respond like in kind, like we don't respond rightly. Instead, we kind of respond as we like in a neglectful way, I guess, sort of like a whatever's left thing, which also, if you think about the words to Jesus worthy of it all, this is like the exact same thing, that's why we wrote that song. But anyways, like the verse is literally everything I'm saying right now. But so we're prone to give our last and worst, but instead we ought to give our first and best. And sometimes even I would say we don't necessarily just give our last and worst. Sometimes I know I'm prone to just give our sufficient, right? Of just like what feels like enough to get by. Like not like, oh, here's the leftovers, but just like, okay, enough to get by. So when we talk about our best musically, we're actually not talking about, man, we want to make the best music possible. Like that's actually not the conversation today at all. Instead, it's actually individually, right? Are you, as an individual, giving your first and best to God musically because He gave His first and best through Jesus, right? Not expecting perfection, but expecting progress, always moving forward, always wanting to give God what He deserves because He's worthy of that. So, I want to read Philippians 4:8-9 right quick. Do you have that one? Cool. You've probably heard this before. But I thought there's a lot here for not just about the worthiness of Christ, but even like when our focus is correct, what it does in us, okay? Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me being Paul, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Right? So when your focus is right, when you're focusing on the right things, the Godward nature of your whole life, not just music, not just what we're talking about here, when your whole life is focused on God and that's what you're considering, that's what's shaping your life, actually you have peace, right? So I think about like speaking musically, times you have insecurities, right? Times you feel like, oh, so-and-so, you're comparing yourself. So-and-so's better than me. So-and-so did this a different way, whatever. When you're focusing on the right things, on the worthiness of Jesus and focusing on what's pure and lovely and excellent, that actually brings you like a supernatural peace where you're not resting in your abilities or your skills, but you're resting in knowing like I'm honoring God with all that I have in my life. including my talents. Okay, so me and Hank were trying to think of some like analogies for this of like what does this compare to, this idea of bringing your first and best. And it's actually really hard to think about because we were trying to think of like what's a task that warrants your first and best, like it requires it of you because the task is worthy of that, right? Now it's actually really hard to think about. It breaks down. All analogies break down like really easily. But the thing we thought about was like thinking about this idea of imagine that you decide, I don't know why you would decide this, maybe you would, or maybe you get told you have to do it, okay? You're going to go on this 2-week long backpacking trip, okay? So, how do you respond to that task? Do you throw a flashlight in a Walmart sack and hope for the best? I mean, maybe you do. Do you think, I went on a bunch of backpacking trips when I was younger, so that'll probably get me through, you know? Or do I like be like, okay, I'm gonna freaking put on this backpack around my house and get used to carrying this weight. I'm gonna put everything I can fit in here, so that any situation comes up, like I'm ready for it. I'm able because I want to be out there and be prepared. I want to like not get out there and be like, oh, I have a flashlight and a Walmart sack. So the analogy breaks down at some point, right? We're not when we're talking about music, we're not. It's not a survival situation so much, but like the task warrants that based on what we've talked about of God giving his first and best and our response to that. So thinking about musically, like are you showing up with a flashlight and a Walmart sack? Are you relying on the fact that you went on backpacking trips when you were younger, when you're 5 and you learned stuff then, or are you always saying, how can I come and do this better and best and have all these tools in my toolbox to give God my first and best, me as an individual. All right. And then just something else, again, this section we're talking about why should we grow as musicians? Like what's the why? And though the worth of Jesus and like God sending him is the primary thing, there's also like giving your first and best for your brothers and sisters that you're serving with and for the congregation, right? Because they're children of God and they've been brought into his kingdom as well. And you're serving with them and wanting to, that like you bringing your first and best actually serves them as well, right? When you're not having hiccups and whatnot. Not that, again, perfection's not the key. It's your first and best. It's progression forward. Okay. So I'm going to talk just briefly about, for the past few months, I've been studying Nehemiah quite a bit. And if you've never spent a lot of time reading it, I mean, obviously it's the Bible, so 10 out of 10 recommend. But there's so much there about leadership and dependence on God and prayer, like the posture of our hearts. There's also a lot about serving and about people. And so when I read this, I wanted to share it with you guys. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time in Nehemiah 3, which is honestly, like if you go and you read the whole thing, it's like what I would call a flyover chapter, where like it's like so-and-so did this thing, and then son of so-and-so also did this thing, and that's the whole chapter, okay? So you're not like missing some riveting like narrative, but go read the whole thing because it'll give you more perspective. But let me give you the context of what's happening before we read a little bit in Nehemiah 3. Okay, so Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer to the king, and God put it on his heart to go rebuild the wall of Jerusalem because Jerusalem had been destroyed. And the king, because Nehemiah had favor with him since he worked for him, let him go. Pretty amazing. And Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem, and he's like, hey, everybody, I want to rebuild the wall. And people just like come out in droves to rebuild it. And that's where Nehemiah 3 picks up. The people have just gotten there, and this is how they're building it. Okay, let's put the Nehemiah verse up there. Okay, like I said, it's really riveting. Okay, here we go. Malchijah, the son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hakerem, repaired the dung gate. Yeah, it's a dung gate. That's exactly what you think it is. He rebuilt it and set its doors, its bolts, and its bars. And Shallum, the son of Kol-Hozeh, ruler of the district of Mitzpah, repaired the fountain gate. He rebuilt it and covered it and set its doors, its bolts, and its bars. And he built the wall of the pool of Shelah of the king's garden as far as the stairs that go down from the city of David. Okay, so I literally just picked like a few verses out of the chapter, okay? Because this is like all that it is, right? I was trying to give you the vibe, okay? The pulse of what this chapter is like. Okay, so basically, the whole chapter is so and so from somewhere is standing next to so and they built this part of the wall, and then so on and so on. And basically, it goes around. This is really interesting. If you ever do read Nehemiah, this chapter goes around the wall counterclockwise and describes the whole like side by side the whole process to build the whole wall. But here are some broad strokes that you can take away from the whole chapter. Okay, just chapter 3, the people coming and building the wall. All right, so the people's response is marked by solidarity. So all of these workers are coming from different regions, they're coming from different backgrounds, but they all have one purpose, to rebuild the wall. And no matter where they work on the wall, and no matter what particular task, you could be the dung gate guy, you know, no matter their particular task, they all have the singular purpose of rebuilding the wall. They have the big picture in mind as they work in their particular places. And it's essential that God's servants keep the overall mission in mind and remember that they're not the only ones working as they give full attention to the task before them on their assigned portion of the wall. So I love that. Thinking about you bringing something unique and it matters, and your focus being on the overall mission actually motivates you to do your part well, because it serves the people around you, right? Imagine if, I might be getting ahead of myself, but imagine if the dung gate guy, imagine if he decides, like, I wish I didn't have the dung gate job, and he didn't do it. Well, then, like, the wall's vulnerable to attack there, right? That's the whole purpose of the wall, really, because he doesn't want to be the dung gate guy. Or let's say he does a crap job on it. Same difference. I wish that was on purpose. It wasn't. It'd be better if it was. Okay, so that's the first broad stroke we see in Nehemiah 3. The second one is that the people's response is marked by responsibility. Each person knows what's expected of him. And there's also women there. Just shout out to the women doing the manual labor. Each person knows what's expected of him and her. Not everyone is expected to do everything, but everyone is expected to do something. And what was true then is true of the church today. Not everyone in the church can do everything, nor are we expected to, but every one of us is called to do something in the Lord's service, right? So they're coming with a sense of responsibility for their part. And then the last one is the people respond voluntarily. And I think this is something that is especially pertinent for you guys, right? Like, we don't take that for granted at all, that you guys are volunteering to come do this thing with us. And that's actually exactly what the people in Nehemiah were doing. They left their families behind. Like, it's saying they're from all these regions. They literally left their wives and children behind to come do the Lord's work. And I think about you guys Seth is trekking from shallow water on a Sunday morning, leaving his wife and kids behind to come and serve the Lord, right? Voluntarily. So a few thoughts on that. They're all doing it because they volunteered. They're zealous for the glory of God, and it's natural for them to volunteer to serve him, right? There's no coercion. Nehemiah's not saying, hey, I really need you guys to come do this. They're voluntarily doing it because they have the overall mission in mind. And then this kind of ties in. This is coming from a commentary, by the way. These little quick points I'm just reading, so I'm not going to take credit for that. Dr. T.J. Betts, in case you're wondering. But this ties in with our overall topic for today. Also, volunteer work does not mean shabby work. We should give our best to God's work, not our leftovers. Too often we give our best to our employers because they pay us. But when it comes to voluntarily serving God, we become slackers. Too many local churches are in disrepair, both physically and spiritually, because believers fail to voluntarily give to Christ their best. That's literally what we're talking about today, right? Thinking about voluntarily, freely, without pressure from us saying, hey, you should give your best. Like, just in your heart, in your soul, the posture of wanting to voluntarily give God your best because he's worthy of that. So that's Nehemiah, and that's also my section. And so here comes Hank. But maybe not. I don't know, because we're wearing the same shirt. So that was all about why do we give God our first and best. And Hank's going to talk about, so how do I do that? How do I bring my first and best? What does that look like practically? What should we do with that? And crap job on the dung gate.
Yeah, do y'all want me to make a joke about how I'm still Mackenzie? Lakin guitar. Box jump pregnant. Hello. What's up, guys? Yeah, sweet. I'll be quick, as much as I can, at least. Um, but yeah, so we're gonna kind of go through how we bring our first and our best. And I kind of wanted to start with a little bit of an example, because I know we're all coming from different contexts. You guys are a part of us leading worship in different ways at different services. And one example of a person that we thought of, when we were putting this all together, was Justin Brown. Does anybody know Justin Brown? You probably don't. Yeah, exactly. He does slides for us, probably about once a month. He's one of the most skilled people at it, and he is just one of the most humble people. He's so quiet. Like if you walked back there and you said hi to him, you might not even hear him if he responded. Like he's such a sweet guy. But one day, he showed up to do slides, and we just kind of noticed him like messing with stuff, like on the screens and all that. And when people do that, I get a little bit worried. I'm like, "What are you doing?" But what he did was he like completely reformatted all of our screens so that the confidence monitors were easier to read at different times depending on what we had going on. So if a lot of y'all have experienced the whole like, wait, it went from lyrics and all that stuff to, oh, I can read scripture now, to back to lyrics. He set all of that up, and I was like, how did he even know how to do it? I don't know. And he didn't like ask. He was just like, this is gonna be better. But it was like that idea of like, he was like I think what I'm getting at is like, he could have just shown up, done the slides, done a great job, would have been awesome. He did do that, but on top of that, he was like, I'm gonna like actually improve something, Um, and I want to be careful with that example there, because I'm not saying like, hey, why aren't you guys showing up and like changing the stage and stuff, um, but that context being that he's like, I can go above and beyond just serving, if that makes sense, and not for our sake, even though that was helpful, right? Again, going back to like why that example is important, it's that in his context, he was like, I'm going to like bring my best. I'm going to like bring my skills into this space, and I'm going to use them to the best of my ability. And one of his skills is a lot of that stuff back there at the computer. So it was just fantastic. But when we talk about our like ability to bring our first and best, and specifically, this is where we're really going to spend a lot of time today. That idea of like continuing to progress. Like, okay, where am I at right now? Where was I? Where can I be? And what's the practical, the best practices and the most practical way to do that. So, we're gonna throw a picture up here. It's a stalagmite. Everybody know what a stalagmite is? Yeah. So I grew up in Carlsbad, and so we had to learn this was like all of our schooling was like, do you know what these are? No. But yeah, so stalagmites stand with might, right? So those are the bottom ones, and then the top ones hold on tight. Those are stalactites. Yeah. But here's why I brought this up. Like, does everybody know how these form? Right? I'm not about like schooling y'all, but like, yeah. Well, no, I'll tell you. Can you just let me do it? Can you please just let me do it? um, so long story short is water drips down from the ceiling from where the stalactite is, onto the ground, and over time it deposits those minerals into really, really like thin, small layers, and so literally over millions of years it forms this thing just from dripping. And I mean dripping. Like if y'all haven't been to somewhere like Carlsbad Caverns before or something like that, like the water's not pouring onto that thing. Like you might even not see it. You'll hear it. You'll hear dripping everywhere. But like it's that kind of like slow, that kind of like overtime progress that forms this thing. And so we're gonna kind of keep that visual a little bit as we go through this. But that's what I want us to think about, especially when we get into this idea of like, well, what does this look like day to day? What does this look like week to week? And then even furthermore, to give you guys a picture of like what our perspective is on this, because I want to make this really clear. Like we are not like teaching this today because we're like, you can all do better. You're all like so far from being good, or something like that. And so make some giant step today and like really, really bring it, like that's not why we really just want to kind of give you guys this perspective, this grace-filled perspective of what progressive development looks like, right? Because it's a slow drip. And it's not about, oh my gosh, where are all my stalagmites? But it's like getting that picture of like, that's the direction we're going. So do we have that? Do we have that in mind? So keeping this picture in mind, are the first step to all of this is our posture. And so when I say posture for the sake of this, we're talking about this foundation, right? So where does the stalagmite start? Starts on the ground. It has to have that good strong foundation. And the way I want to define this is a lot of the things that Mackenzie was talking about is that idea of like, why would I want to bring my first and best? And when we were putting all of this together, we were literally like, yeah, why would you, right? Why would you show up to this place and bring your first and best? I haven't paid a single one of you, right? You're not getting presents or anything like that. Maybe every now and then at the Corny Awards, if you have a really funny semester, you know. Uh, but but even think of it like from the Christian perspective, like why would we come here and bring our first and our best? Even thinking about the Nehemiah verse as well, you know. Um, and kind of like what Mackenzie was saying when we were trying to think of examples, like it came to me, I was like, the reason we can't think of an example is because every example in life is the subverted version of what Christ has done for us, right? Which is where, like, for example, I was like, when we were thinking of stuff, I was like, well, what about school? Like, you bring your first and best in school. Well, you do that to get a good grade, right? You don't just do that because it's the right thing to do. No, you need a good grade. You know, or if you're at your job, well, it's because you're getting paid to do it, you know, and you want to keep your job. But bringing your first and best at church is kind of weird because we're stepping into a space where the first and best has already been brought, right? It's been brought by Christ. And I don't mean that in a corny way. Like, as each individual, like each of us steps into the space where, like, I literally believe that the first and best has already been brought. And so it's when I use that word subverted, right? It's that, like, I'm not stepping into a space where I have to earn my spot or earn my keep. The keep has already been earned. And so I'm bringing my first and best because of the worthiness of the one who's already brought it. There was a really good example that I heard on a podcast one time where it was like, think of the Christian life as you have stepped into something like med school, and at the door, Christ is like, I've earned your degree for you already. The rest of your time in school is you learning how to have that degree. You already have it. Like, you're not earning it. But the rest of your walk in the Christian life is like, okay, but now how do I be the person that has that degree, right? And so when we think about that, again, in our Christian life, but then also thinking about that, like, in that same grace-filled perspective of, like, I'm coming here, I'm giving my first and best, not because I'm trying to earn my keep, right? My keep's already been earned, but Christ is worth it. And so how can I keep taking that next step just to be a little bit better, like a little bit more improved? So that's kind of like what we're talking about there. So, but if that first element, that bottom part, is posture, that's where we want to come from, is asking ourselves that question. And, you know, it's not the answer is not really going to change. You know, it's just always like reminding ourselves, why would I bring my first and best? It's because my keep has already been earned by Christ, right? And He is worth my first and best. So therefore, I will do my best to bring it. And so if that first step is posture, the second step is perspective. So this is asking yourself questions like, well, where am I at currently as far as skill is concerned? Where do I need to get? What limitations or obstacles do I have musically? Deficiencies. So what comes easy for me? And again, this is all subjective. So this is not like comparing yourself to another person, though another person might be a good element of perspective where it's like, wow, look at that thing they're able to do. I'd love to be able to do that, you know? But again, it's not that element of comparison. I think, so for example, like with me, I have really been trying my darndest to, like, memorize chord sheets before leading. And so the way that started was that at rehearsals, I would use my chord sheets, but then for that second time through rehearsal, I'd be like, okay, I don't want to look at them. You know, that might mean that I kind of forgot something a little bit, but I'm going to force myself to be like, okay, let's try to remember. And that's just kind of, like I said, a subjective thing where I was just like, I want to not have to look at them anymore. I want to be able to lead and have the chords memorized. And so that's kind of like that little step that I'm trying to take right now. Nobody's making me. Okay, this is just, I just want to do it. Okay. But again, that subjective aspect where it's like thinking to yourself, like, well, what's kind of like where am I at? What's one step forward I could take? But then also as a part of this perspective thing, and I want us to think about this. We'll kind of talk about this a little bit later, but I also think I want us to keep this as a part of like our culture moving forward, because another element of perspective is looking back, right, and celebrating how far we've come. And so all of you in here are progressing, right? We're not doing this again. We're not doing this talk today because we're like everybody's stagnant. Like, come on, shake it off. No, we're we're all progressing, and so there is a lot of value, not just spiritually, but for the sake of talking about our progress. When we decide to say, I'm going to take a second, look in the rearview mirror, see how far I've come, like look at what God has done. Look at the work that He's done in my life. Look at the work that I've put into my craft, my trade, and look how far I've come. Like, and celebrating those things. And I think, and we'll spend some time on that here in a little bit. There's a lot of value in doing that together too. You know, saying like, hey, I've seen you come this far. I've seen you. You know, so. Anyways, so that second step is perspective. By the way, they all start with P's. Oh, part of the SBC. What? um, I don't know. Whatever. So then that third step is patterns, and so that's where this visual of this whole deal is really going to come back into play, right? Because like we were talking about, the water is dripping. It's doing it a lot over time. Well, I say a lot. It's doing it slowly, right? But imagine if all of a sudden that source of water was to move an inch to the left, right? It stopped growing. The stalagmite's done. You know, maybe another one's going to start, but this one's done. And so when we talk about patterns, it's this idea of, okay, like what am I doing consistently over time for the sake of the progress of my craft? A good example of that kind of like fault, I would say, is like, let's say someone like Seth was like, okay, like I'm a skilled worship leader. I have a great voice. I'm really good at guitar. What's my next step? Well, I think I'm going to get into the vuvuzela. You know, that stupid thing that they blow at the, I say stupid, it's not stupid. It's just, there's a lot of jokes about it, right? It's that horn that they blow at soccer games and stuff. Like, I'm not saying that wouldn't be cool for him to do that, but when we're talking about this idea of like, okay, I want to grow in my craft, I want to grow, okay, you just added something. You didn't necessarily decide to like focus on getting better at what you're doing, right? Um, and so, and again, it's not like there's anything wrong with that. That might have been a bad example. But what we're talking about here is not, okay, let's just get better at a bunch of stuff, but rather focusing on how can we progress, right? Okay, I know what I'm good at, and that could be multiple things, which is great. So how am I progressing in those things? And those patterns being things like consistency and commitment to what you're doing. Because ultimately this is where like the rubber meets the road, right? Is okay. I'm not just thinking to myself, I want to get better. I'm thinking about what I'm doing to get better, what it looks like for me to practice, what it looks like for me to ask for feedback from people. I really think this is where the element of like our coaching relationships come into play, right? Like you can lean on your coaches for things like this, like hey, well, what's something I could do to kind of get a little bit better at this? What's something I could do to kind of just that little next step in maybe my strumming, or playing the right chords a little bit more often, or something like that. One of the things we're going to talk about here at the end is SMART goals for the whole point of all this, because it really helps with like the whole setting up the patterns thing, right? Where it's like, again, rather than just saying I just want to get better, well, how, and making sure. So we'll talk about that here in a second. But yeah, sweet. And then the last, let's say, yeah, kind of last step. The fourth step, another P, is push. So when we talk about this kind of like slow progression of all this stuff, and this is where the stalagmite visual breaks down, because the stalagmite doesn't need motivation, but we do, right? Like it can be very hard to be like, I feel like I've plateaued, or I feel like maybe I'm not getting or I'm not getting better as fast as I'd like to, which that could kind of be a whole other discussion. Point being, like thinking to yourself, how do I keep going? How do I take the next step that takes me to that next small step of progress? And I think the two biggest ways, as far as like, and we kind of already talked about them, as far as like the umbrella is concerned, is again, celebration of one another. like doing your best anytime you see someone and you really feel like they've improved, saying like, "Hey, I've just noticed like you've really come a long way, over the last semester," or something like that, or even just celebrating when they do something well in the moment, like, "Hey, you killed it when you did that thing, like, that was awesome." Um, and then the other kind of element, the other umbrella idea will be like accountability. So again, going back to the coaching aspect, I also think this can be a social deal. But going back to the coaching, like leaning on your coaches, like, hey, tell me where I could improve. Also, be bold and ask like, where have I improved? Is there anywhere where you've seen that I've done better than last time? And hopefully with the culture of the coaching thing, we'll do a lot of like setting up goals for you guys like over the course of a semester or something, where it's like, hey, by the end of the semester, let's try to get a little bit better at this. But yeah. Um, well, then that last step, that last P is progress. Let me see. Do we want to? Is everybody like in there? Okay. Do we need to just kind of like cut this off? Yeah, let's just wrap it up. Will you go ahead and throw up the SMART goal thing just real quick? So have y'all heard of SMART goals? I'm assuming, yeah, it's not a new thing. I made it up a long time ago. Yeah, yeah, I came up with it just a long time ago, so it's not new. I probably came up with it like 45 years ago. But yeah, so it's this idea of like, if you just say, I'm gonna go learn how to play piano, like you've set yourself up for you set yourself up for failure, right? Because that's not a SMART goal. A SMART goal is something that's you gotta be smart, right? So SMART is like, you want to be specific, like, and you want it to be well defined. So rather than just being like, I'm gonna learn how to play, you're Andy, get out. Um, right? But then this is where this gets so measurable, right? So I want to maybe not just learn piano, but learn a certain song, or something like that, something measurable where you're like, okay, I know when I've done it because this happened, right? Achievable, so that's more like subjective, right? So rather than just giving yourself this impossible task, you're like, well, what's something that I actually know that I can do? Similar with realistic. Is it something that I have the resources to do? Is it something that I have the space to do? Or am I setting myself up for failure by saying I want to learn an instrument that I don't have and I don't have the access to, something like that. And then timely. I think this is probably one of the most important things, is giving yourself like a finish line, right? Rather than saying, well, I'm just going to learn piano, I'll get there at some point. It's like, no, like I want to learn to play a certain song on a piano that I have by the end of the semester, right? Now all of a sudden you have kind of a SMART goal. And so I'll give you guys some handouts here with it's like a SMART goal like breakdown thing. I was hoping we would have time to kind of do a little bit of it here today, but we're wrapping things up. And then will you just go to the discussion questions real quick? Yeah, so these are things that I was kind of hoping we would be able to talk through. But if y'all wanted to take a picture of it or whatever, I'm hoping, again, we kind of want to set up this culture of this stuff. And so I will tell you that what we're going to do, maybe not this exact thing, but we're going to take kind of like a version of this idea of like, okay, if we're thinking about progressive development over time and all this stuff, and maintaining that culture. We're gonna take something like this and we're gonna post it up in the tunnel. We're gonna post it in your homes. Okay, so look out. I'm sneaky. Just kidding. But yeah, it's gonna be everywhere. You better. No, but just to kind of keep our kind of focus on this, and it's not going to be, again, it's not going to be these exact things, because I really want us to keep in mind this grace filled aspect of this too, right? Where it's like, we're not like, hey, you better like always be getting better because I'm watching, but rather like this is kind of what we've been called to, right? We've been called not only to the pursuit of holiness, but the like literally the progressive forwardness of our lives is something that is a Christ. A Christ called element of being a Christian.